Have you ever wondered what might be hidden within the pages of an old book? Those very books covered in dust, forgotten on library shelves, or tucked away in the dark corners of abandoned storage rooms. There could be more to them than just words. Our story begins at an ordinary student party. In a lively room filled with laughter and music, Kira brought something unusual: an old book. Its worn appearance, yellowed pages, and strange symbols immediately caught everyone's attention. But it was the words on the cover: "Do not open, or you will awaken what has been sleeping for centuries," that became the catalyst for what would unfold next. They had no idea that carefree curiosity would turn their evening into the most horrifying nightmare. Kira was an archaeology student. She had stumbled upon the book by chance while sorting through old boxes in the university storage room. What caught her attention was the unusual glow emanating from the book when she held it in her hands. Naturally, she decided to show it to her friends, thinking it was just an interesting find. At the party, Dennis, the life of the group, immediately suggested, "Why don't we perform a ritual? Like in the movies." The idea seemed harmless. Everyone laughed and agreed to go along with it. It was just a game after all. Kira wanted to object, but her words were drowned out by the music and the general excitement. The group turned off the lights, arranged some candles, and sat in a circle. Denise ceremoniously placed the book in the center and opened it. On the first page, there was nothing remarkable, just an old drawing of a strange creature that looked like a mix between a human and a beast. But on the second page, there was text in a language no one recognized. That's when Roma, who was studying Latin, that confidently said, "This is an ancient language, but I can try to read it. There's nothing scary about it." He began reading the words aloud. Each word sounded like a clap of thunder in the room, but no one paid it much attention. Instead, they continued to laugh. When Roma finished reading, nothing happened. The lights were turned back on, and everyone laughed about how it had been a waste of time. So much for the ritual. Dennis smirked. They continued partying, but soon, that strange thing started to happen. The room became freezing cold, even though the heating was on. The curtains rustled as if hit by a strong wind, but the windows were shut. Shadows began to appear on the walls, shadows that had no right to be there. Dennis stepped closer to examine one of them, and it moved toward him. It wasn't just a trick of the light. The shadows seemed to be reaching for him. Panic started to set in. Kira was the first to realize something had gone terribly wrong. She screamed for everyone to leave the room, but the door, which no one had closed, was suddenly locked. The group rushed to the windows, but they wouldn't budge. "This is just someone's prank, right?" Roma muttered, but his voice trembled with unease. Dima, who had been standing quietly in the corner until now, suddenly froze. He stared at a single spot and then began speaking in the same language that had been in the book. His voice became deep and unnatural, as if someone else was speaking through him. "We've awakened something." "This isn't a joke," Kira whispered, staring at the book, which was now glowing with a sinister red light. Dima suddenly fell silent and collapsed to the floor. The group rushed to him, but his eyes were wide open, his gaze empty, as though he was looking right through them. "Dima, wake up!" Kira shouted, shaking him by the shoulders, but there was no response. At that moment, the candles around them suddenly went out, and the room was engulfed in impenetrable darkness. One of the group turned on the flashlight of their phone, and its light revealed something in the darkness that made them freeze in terror. Strange symbols, similar to those in the book, began to appear on the wall before them. They pulsed with red light as though they were alive. Then, the room began to shake. The tables, the chairs, even the walls, everything vibrated as if during an earthquake. The group, overwhelmed with panic, tried to understand what was happening. "Kira, what's with the book? You said you found it by accident, right?" Dennis shouted, but his voice was no longer angry, only filled with fear. Kira, with trembling hands, pulled the book out and quickly flipped through the pages, but her gaze stopped on one of the last pages, where there was an image of the same creature as on the first page. But now it looked different. Its eyes were glowing, and its hands reached out toward her. "It's all because of the book," Roma yelled, grabbing it and trying to wrench it from Kira's hands. At that moment, strange shadows, which had quietly been shifting in the corners of the room, began to move toward them. "Throw it away, burn it," Katya screamed, but it seemed that Kira was glued to the book. Her hands almost fused to its cover. I can't let it go," she whispered. The shadows grew closer, their outlines becoming increasingly human-like, but with inhuman, twisted faces. They hissed, making sounds that sent chills down their spines. Suddenly, Dima, who had been lying still all this time, began to rise. But this was no longer him. His movements were jerky, and his eyes glowed with bright red light, just like the symbols on the walls. "This is not Dima," Katya said, stepping back. The creature, now inhabiting Dima's body, began to speak. Its voice was deep and menacing. "You have disturbed the slumber of ancient evil. Now you will pay the price." These words caused another violent jolt in the room, throwing the group in all directions like ragdolls. "We have to do something. We have to stop it." Denis yelled, trying to grab the book, but he was thrown back by an invisible force. Then Roma remembered that there were words on one of the pages that looked like a spell. "Tira, find the spell, quickly," he shouted. With trembling hands, she flipped through the pages and stopped at the very phrase they had read earlier. But next to it, in tiny letters, there was another text that clearly instructed how to complete the ritual. "But what if it doesn't work? What if it gets even worse?" she whispered. But they had no choice. Kira began to read the text from the book, but her voice trembled, the words coming out in a tangled mess. The creature in Dima's body turned toward her and slowly moved forward. Its steps were heavy, each one echoing through the silence of the room. "You think this will stop me?" it growled, and at that moment, all the candles flared up with a bright flame, as though issuing a challenge. Fear paralyzed each of the group members, but Kira pressed on. Her voice grew louder, more confident, the words sounding like a challenge to the darkness. The symbols on the walls began to change. Now they glowed brighter, but their light was no longer red. It was cold, almost icy. The shadows around them started to writhe, as if something had angered them. The creature froze for a moment, then let out a scream so loud that the glass in the windows shattered. It was an inhuman cry filled with pain and fury. "Keep going, Kira," Roma yelled, covering his ears to block out the horrible sound. But suddenly, Kira's hands began to shake, and the book slipped from her fingers, falling to the floor. The creature immediately lunged at her, but at that moment, Denis rushed to block its path, trying to hold it back. "Run, Tira, keep reading," he shouted, but the creature knocked him away with one swift blow. Tira grabbed the book from the floor and continued reading. Now her voice sounded like music, as though the words were finding their own way. The candle flames began to dim, and the light from the symbols started to fill the room. Roma and Katya struggled to hold the creature back, which was writhing in agony. "Finish it!" they shouted, fighting with all their strength. Tira reached the last words of the spell and, taking a deep breath, said them loudly and clearly. At that moment, the room was engulfed in a blinding light, forcing everyone to shut their eyes. When the light faded, an eerie silence filled the room. The group slowly opened their eyes and looked around. The creature was gone. The symbols on the walls no longer glowed, and the candles had all gone out. Dima lay on the floor, motionless again. "Dima!" Kira screamed, rushing to him. This time, his eyes were open, but they reflected exhaustion and pain. What happened?" he whispered faintly. The group sighed in relief, realizing that, at least for the moment, it was over. However, on the floor, where the book had once been, there was a handprint burned into the surface, as if scorched into it. Kira stared at it in horror. "The book? It's gone," she said. But just then, Denis noticed something else. In the corner of the room, where the shadows had once been, there was a faint trace, as though someone had stood there, watching them until the very end. "We unleashed something much bigger than that creature," he said quietly. No one dared to speak a word. After everything that had happened, the group decided they needed to leave this place as soon as possible. They were almost completely drained of energy, each feeling as if the night had taken years off their lives. As they gathered their belongings, Roma noticed that the basement door was locked again, as if nothing had ever happened. "Someone or something doesn't want this story to get out," he said thoughtfully. They exchanged anxious glances, but no one argued. They simply needed to leave, forget everything, if that was even possible. When they left the house, it was already beginning to dawn. The fresh morning air felt strangely quiet, as though nature itself was holding its breath. Watching them, no one spoke. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts. Kira walked ahead, clutching the amulet they had found next to the book. "We did it. But at some point, I felt like it wasn't as simple as it seemed," she said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but there was a heaviness in it from everything they had endured. As they made their way home, each of them realized that this night had left an indelible mark on their lives. The memories of the creature, the book, and the symbols on the walls haunted them. They remained silent, but each understood that something had changed forever. Kadia suddenly stopped and looked at the others. What if that was just the first step? What if we didn't just open one door, but several? That question hung in the air, making them all freeze. Days later, everything felt like a dream, but a strange coldness remained in each of them. Kira started studying books on rituals, trying to find any explanations. Roma couldn't sleep at night, thinking about what had happened. Dima tried to return to his normal life, but sudden bouts of weakness reminded him that he had become part of something much bigger. Dinis tried to convince himself that it was just an accident, but deep down, he knew it was only the beginning. The group agreed never to speak of that night again, but the secret remained between them. Perhaps they had won this time, but the price had been too high. And somewhere, far beyond their understanding, darkness was already preparing for the next step. This story was just the first act of a much more terrifying and complex game. None of them knew it yet, but the doors they had opened could lead to consequences they hadn't even imagined. Friends, this story proves that darkness can be closer than we think, and sometimes it's better to leave the forbidden untouched. If you enjoyed diving into this world of mysteries and horrors, support our channel. Subscribe so you don't miss new creepy stories. Give us a like if you found it interesting, and make sure to leave a comment sharing what you would have done in the hero's shoes. Or maybe you already have your own scary stories you'd like to share. Who knows, perhaps your story will become the foundation for our next video. Thank you for staying with us until the end, and we'll see you in our next dark adventure.